Can you hear me? Yep. Okay. Hello. Nice, and thank you very much for being here. I am Marco Villi. I will be the host of this first session of the morning today on the role and challenges on network of subnational actors in facing transboundary climate risk and building resilience. Well, just a couple notes for everybody. The first, as you definitely know, because you have been in many events up to the moment, you need to use the headphones, otherwise you won't really hear, although this is a little bit like calm this morning, so we're fine for the moment. Second thing, the session is going to be live streamed, so that you know. Yeah, whatever. Good to know. And well, the session today, the idea is to speak. There will be like to speak a little bit about what are exactly the role and and challenges of these, and particularly we will have three blocks. So we start opening remarks. Then we will have a first block in which we'll be talking about the experience of the IMBOA network and some of the actors that work around that in trying to work and do the boundary work, and particularly boundary work around boundary risks. So we'll talk a lot about boundaries and how to overcome those boundaries. And then we will be talking about the work and experience around the Race to Resilience campaign, and also the work that it does to align different kinds of non-state actors around different risk in every part of the world. So again, crossing boundaries in science, in sectors, and in nations, of course. So we will start with some opening remark here from Emily Beauchamp. Thank you, if you want to accompany us here. So Emily Beauchamp will talk a little about the importance of data-driven assessment and monitoring evaluation of transboundary risk. Emily is the lead in monitoring. I don't know what happens. There's like a... No, there is something. Yeah. I know, fine. Yeah, well, she is the head of monitoring, evaluation, and learning on the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD. And she's also been working together with the Race to Resilience campaign as a co-lead of the Meteorological Advisory Group for many years. So it's like a real honor to have her here. So Emily, this is yours.
Thank you so much. And I think if you stand in that corner, you get feedback from the other rooms. I'm gonna go at the back. No, I'm joking. Thank you so much, Marco, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning. I'd invite everybody to just come in front because we can have like more of a discussion. It's much nicer when you're up here. I'm not gonna speak very, very lengthily, but there's a couple of things that I want to talk about in transboundary climate risks. And the main thing is that I want to remind folks that we did have quite a significant decision last year at COP28 with the GGA framework, or what is lovely called the UAE framework for global climate resilience, that did acknowledge the importance of transboundary climate risks in addressing adaptation and in achieving the global goal on adaptation as part of the Paris Agreement. And that's important because it starts really giving a signal and a mandate for organizations to flag that there is a lot of work that needs to be done. But we're in a little bit of a pickle here, because actually everything in the UNFCCC is party-driven, and everything is country-based. So all the reporting, all the national monitoring, evaluation, and learning system that I work on so much, everything is country-based and driven. And there's a lot of actors already that countries have to deal with. You know, how do you connect with local communities, the most vulnerable, universities, private sector, etc. And then what do you do with transboundary climate risks? So where does that fit into this? And I think that's why it's really important, our session today, to talk about the role of boundary organizations and also examples of transboundary climate risk work. And for us to also really remind ourselves that we need to do this work. But also I think I'll pose a question to every panelist. If you can add to, I'm sure, already well-prepared speeches, what do you think can be done and should be done to better link with the national systems? And I'm obviously thinking about data and about assessments. So when you have, for example, grades transboundary climate risk assessments, how does the data feed back into governmental initiatives? How can you make sure that there are linkages between the different actors that are, in other words, legitimately responsible to take care of these risks? And how can we make sure that we share the data with all the the relevant actors. Because in the end, we won't be restructuring the UNFCCC. So we really need to find a way to work within a nationally driven process, but that really acknowledges transboundary climate risk. So I'm really looking forward to hearing folks' views on this question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emily, for your words, which kind of frame a little bit the reason we are here and some of the challenges. I'm very keen to hear what all the speakers will have to say about the question that Emily is framing to all of us. So to start exploring about that, we will now go to the first panel. As I said before, we have two panels here. For the first panel, I will call here in front Kautar Makachi from the FOSI Morocco, also representative of the INBOA network, please. Then we'll have Laura Ramajo for the Center for Climate Resilient Research and also the Technical Secretariat of the Race to Resilience. And finally, Katie Harris from the SEI and representing the Adaptation Without Borders initiative. Thank you very much to the three of you for being here now. So, Kautar, we will start with you. The idea in this moment is that we will talk a little bit to start in this panel to talk about the boundary work. We will start to say, like, we'll be talking a lot about boundaries, so we'll talk about the role of boundary organizations in promoting adaptation in transboundary risk and the work that has been done by the INBOA network for that. So it would be nice to hear from you what a boundary organization is, why there is the INBOA network, and what and why has been addressing these kind of questions. And then we will go to Laura and Kati to hear about two examples of boundary initiatives from the INBOA network, and we'll learn a little bit more about them, their experiences and challenges. So Kautar, this is to you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much, Marco. Hello, everyone. So like Marco said, I'm Kautar. I work at the Climate Change Competency Center, 4C. We're based in Rabat, Morocco. 4C is actually a member of INBOA, and we also sit on its advisory committee. And it's in that capacity that I have the great pleasure of presenting the INBOA network today. So just as a reminder, INBOA is international network of boundary organizations on adaptation. And yeah, as the name suggests, at the core of the network is this concept of boundary organization. The concept was actually introduced over 20 years ago. Many definitions were developed since. As a network, we're still agreeing internally on the definition we want to use, but I think the one that you can see on screen gives us does a pretty good job at describing what a boundary organization is. So I'll just read. It's an organization that specifically and actively facilitates the process of enabling exchange between, on one hand, the producer of knowledge, and on the other, the users of knowledge, to support evidence-informed decision-making in a specific context. Obviously, the context we're speaking about here, it's adaptation to climate change, and like, how do you accelerate adaptation to climate change? And to simplify, I guess, the concept, you can see the graph here. A boundary organization basically sits at work at this interface between science and society, or science and policy, basically between knowledge and action. So why did we think it would be a good idea to establish yet another international network on adaptation, but this time dedicated to boundary work? This actually stemmed from two observations. The first one, we know the literature is quite clear. Boundary organizations are very effective at accelerating climate change. How do they do that? Like I said, they mediate between scientific expertise and policymakers on the ground. The second observation, and backed up by literature again, is that unfortunately there's quite limited interaction between the existing boundary organization. That means less sharing, that means duplicate efforts, that means basically missed opportunities to actually have impact on the ground. Why is that? We believe it like three main reasons. Boundary organizations tend to produce fewer publications than traditional research institutions. They're often regionally focused, so not necessarily aware of other organizations doing the same type of work in other parts of the world. And finally, even though they do boundary work, they don't necessarily recognize themselves in this concept, in this label of boundary organization. Hence, we thought the need to create a space to link these boundary organizations specifically working on adaptation. So the INBOA network was established back in October 2023 in Montreal during the Adaptation Futures conference. What is the vision? So INBOA aims to create a mutual learning space for boundary organizations to enhance their impact, help them grow, increase their collective contribution to global adaptation. And how do we, how we're trying to do that is basically through three main strategies. So knowledge sharing between the members. That can be through organizing webinars, conferences, working sessions. The second is advocacy. So as a network, pushing for the importance of boundary work in general and boundary organizations, and obviously the urgency to accelerate adaptation to climate change. And finally, capacity building, and that can take different forms. It can be staff exchange, research exchange, training sessions, etc. The network is a member-driven, member-led network, and you can see here on the slide the 23 organizations that make up so far the network. I won't read all of them, but you can see the names, and I think what's very interesting is that they come from both the global north and the global south, so it's nicely distributed all over the world. What I'm finding even more interesting is that they're really, these are very different types of organization. They're all boundary organization, but you have university research centers, you have organizations that were set up from the get-go as a boundary organization, and you have others that ended up during boundary work to meet the missions that were set up to achieve. Sorry. So what have we been doing for the past year? I've talked already about the initial membership and the members we have. We also set up a preliminary governance structure. So I mentioned the advisory committee earlier that was set up in April or May of 2024. We launched both a website and a LinkedIn page. The website is both in French and in English, and developed some programs. So in June, in Bonn, during the SBs, the first workshop was held on the boundary organization model. In August, the network provided financial support to an application to organize a summer school on adaptation and to focus on boundary work. In September, I'm sorry, that's not me then, is it? I do apologize if it's me. Oh. I said the word accelerate too much, and well, I can carry on. So in September, the network spoke at a panel during the Innovate for City conference that was organized in Montreal. In October, a second workshop was led by SEI, was organized on policy engagement to accelerate adaptation action. Many members actually spoke and I had the pleasure of participating as well. And this, leads us to COP29. We organized 3 main events. The first one was the annual showcase event on Friday morning. Yesterday evening was the networking event, so I met some of you, and today the last event. I'm trying to remember the slides now. Oh yeah, okay. Next steps. The next steps as an advisory committee. We're working on finalizing the concept note. So I was mentioning. Okay, great. I was mentioning earlier the definition, but also the objective, the goals, and based on that concept note, try and recruit some new members. And we're also working on a funding strategy to make sure that we can work long term. So if you're interested or just curious about joining the network, these are the requirements or the criteria. If your organization has expertise and experience working on climate adaptation, if it's working specifically on bridging the gap between science and policy, specifically on adaptation, and if it has impact on communities and region, then please get in touch. And this is the QR code if you want to learn more about us. I think that's it from my side. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you very much, Kautar. An applause, please. Thank you very much. So we learned a little bit like both the importance, but also the key challenges that boundary organizations have in doing their work, and then why sometimes networking, getting together, learning one from each other, supporting, creating synergies, as in many things, also in this boundary work is very important. So thank you very much, Kautar, to explain for us a little bit like what the IMBO has been doing. Now to go on, we will hear about two examples of initiatives that are being created, nested, or supported by the network in different ways. We will first hear by Katie Harris. She's a senior policy fellow at CEI headquarters. She focuses on global governance of climate change adaptation, and particularly she's very interested in understanding the interaction between different kinds of risk factors, the ripple effects of adaptation strategies. And because of that, she is also director of the Adaptation Without Borders initiatives, in which she has been working exactly in bringing together also like networking different kinds of actors or different kinds to try and understand how we can work in adaptation across or without borders. So Katie, to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Marco. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for having me at this IMBOA event. And indeed, I think the work of Adaptation Without Borders is interesting because we cross two kinds of boundaries. So we're looking at the climate risks that cross administrative and jurisdictional boundaries and borders. But we are also crossing borders between science and policy. And that's very much core to how we work. So I'll try and tell you a little bit more about both of those aspects. But yeah, Adaptation Without Borders is a partnership. It's been going since 2019. We now have 13 organizations from around the world, and we work very specifically on the topic of transboundary climate risks. So we are trying to strengthen and sort of cultivate more regional and international cooperation on adaptation, particularly to manage the transboundary impacts of climate change. When I talk about transboundary effects, we often might bring to mind that climate change can sort of spread risks between neighbouring countries, those that might share a river or a water basin, for example, and how climate change impacts in one country might generate effects downstream in another country. But what we also look at as a partnership is how a country might be exposed and vulnerable to climate impacts from countries much further afield. For instance, if the impacts of climate change disrupt their imports of food or medicine, if it disrupts pharmaceutical supply chains, for instance, or might really have grave economic effects if it's disrupting the import of critical raw materials or commodities that country's economy is reliant upon. Or if climate change, for instance, might disrupt the flows of remittances that a country depends on, or its foreign direct investments. So when we talk about transboundary climate risks, it's really important to keep in mind that we're really working across multiple different sectors, and these risks have implications not only for environment ministries and planning ministries, but also trade ministries and finance ministries and foreign policy as well. These risks really can impact food and water insecurity. They can threaten trade or energy supplies in many cases. It can disrupt regional infrastructure on which many countries are reliant, such as ports and so forth, and really put jobs and health and well-being at risk. And so we have to manage these risks if we're to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, but we also have to manage these risks if we're to meet a whole range of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think, as Emily said in the introduction, we got some decision text on transboundary climate risks for the first time at COP28. So in decision 1, on the outcome of the global stocktake, parties recognise that climate change impacts are often transboundary in nature and may involve complex, cascading risks that require knowledge sharing and international cooperation for addressing them. And they also emphasised that the UAE framework for global climate resilience should catalyse and strengthen regional and international cooperation on the scaling up of adaptation action and support among parties, international organisations and non-governmental organisations for this. In decision 2 on the global goal on adaptation, parties went on to say that such risks, transboundary risks, also require climate-informed transboundary management, so transboundary management and cooperation on global adaptation solutions. So here parties are really calling us to work together, work more collaboratively, work across boundaries and borders in a much more collaborative and cooperative way than we have so far planned and implemented adaptation to date. So I think this really calls upon us to then answer some key questions. What does it actually look like to advance knowledge sharing on transboundary climate risks? What do governments, international organisations, communities, companies need to know about to inform their priorities, I guess, for adaptation to transboundary climate risks? How concretely can we spur this cooperation? Who needs to cooperate? Who needs to take the initiative on that? And what does that cooperation look like in practice? And what are some of the global adaptation solutions to these risks? Are they quite different, perhaps, from the adaptation solutions that we might have thought about so far? So these are some of the questions that the partnership, the Adaptation Without Borders partnership, is trying to answer. We have 3 pillars to our work. So first of all, we have a research and knowledge generation pillar to our work. So this is really the science part of the science to policy interface. So there we're trying to design conceptual methods, frameworks, tools to identify, assess, measure and track these kinds of risks. How do we integrate transboundary climate risks into climate risk and vulnerability assessments, for instance? We are also trying to do empirical research, so in more layman's terms, sort of case studies around the world to understand how are these risks already manifesting and materializing for different countries and communities around the world. How are they manifesting differently for different groups in society? Are particular groups in society more at risk from these than others because of their levels of vulnerability? So that's the sort of the research that we're doing. We then have a really strong policy engagement pillar. So this is the other part to the sort of what boundary organisations do that we just heard about. So there we've been running for the last 2 years through a programme of work that was supported by the European Commission, a range of what we call policy tracks. So first of all, we really tried to engage in UNFCCC negotiation tracks and different agenda items. So first of all, identifying negotiation tracks that we thought were most relevant for raising transboundary climate risks up the agenda of the UNFCCC. So that was the global stocktake and the global goal on adaptation, and particularly in the last couple of years, the GLAS, so the Glasgow to Sharm el-Sheikh work programme on the global goal on adaptation, and now the UAE to Belém work programme to develop indicators. And we really worked with parties, with negotiators to really understand and hear, first of all, their concerns about considering transboundary risks in these forums, their complexity, the level of uncertainty that come with them, but also talk to them about why it's necessary, what the research and evidence is showing. We produced a flagship report called the Global Transboundary Climate Risk Report in 2023, and then we really engaged with negotiators at successive SBs and COPs on those findings. We then ran 2 regional tracks. So the first of those was to work with, to understand the transboundary climate risks that Africa was facing and African countries. And we partnered up with the African Group of Negotiators Expert Support Group, or AGNES, also with Enda Energy and ILRI, who are members of the partnership based in East and West Africa. And then we worked with the African Union Commission, AUDA-NAPAD, so the African Union Development Agency, and a number of others, also with regional economic communities, to start to put together a roadmap for what does building resilience to transboundary climate risks across the region look like in practice. And to do this, we produced a number of very policy-driven research pieces that were led by those partners, and also including ODI, to explore what were the governance mechanisms, what policies were already out there that could help manage these risks more effectively in the future. We were really delighted to see in the African Union Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy, an action plan that runs from 2022 to 2032, that there was an action point in that strategy around strengthening cooperation between member states of the African Union and the regional economic communities to manage transboundary and cascading climate risks. And this roadmap that we have developed actually advances actions towards that goal. So it's really firmly embedded in the lead policy process of the African Union, or the lead policy document, I should say, on adaptation of the African Union. We also worked with a number of those same stakeholders at 2 consecutive AMCENs, so the African Ministerial Conference of Environment Ministers, to achieve a high-level decision on the topic also in 2023. That was really critical for really showing that our work and this our work to prioritise transboundary climate risks as part of the adaptation work that the African Union was doing was really supported by ministers and supported by member states, and had that high-level political support. So transboundary climate risks are now a real priority for the African Group of Negotiators that they are sort of supporting here at the COP29 negotiations. And we're now working with the LDC group and the AGN to develop some indicators to feed into the UAE Belém work programme on indicators that reflect transboundary climate risks and reflect our progress in building resilience towards them, or measure our progress in building resilience towards them. We also did a similar piece of work but focused on the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, where a number of transboundary climate risks are evident. We worked there very closely, or it was led by ICIMOD, whose 8 member countries face a wealth of transboundary climate risks that not only sort of are amplified within the region, but they also face risks more internationally from climate change impacts all around the world that they then import, if you like, to the region. And we're releasing a number of briefs here at the COP, and we've got an event later today that I encourage you to join. And then we've also, the 5th track was on engaging with the private sector, particularly on transboundary climate risk to trade and supply chains. And for that work, we have been, again, really working at crossing another boundary to look at what should be the different roles of the public sector and the private sector in managing these risks, and with a number of gatekeeper organisations, including the World Economic Forum and others. So that just gives you a bit of a sense of what we've been doing. I think now, just in the last minute or so, the challenge for us really is to start to identify then what are the actual adaptation solutions, the adaptation programs to manage these risks. And that comes back to Emily's point about how can governments and other sort of other bodies and entities that are implementing adaptation projects and programs actually build resilience to these risks. And part of that answer is by integrating these into policies right across government, so from trade to finance to foreign policy. But it's also really starting to answer the question, what does resilience building to these risks look like in practice? So this is where I'd say it's important we've got to cross another boundary in policy to practice if we're to really see, in a few COPs' time that we can see more programs that are building resilience to these risks in practical terms. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Well, definitely you show lots of boundaries and we can go across lots of them. So it's very, very interesting, the work, and also very useful to understand this global work, but in science, moving exactly the boundary of these, both in research and in policy, and trying to frame this so that hopefully this is becoming, because it's definitely becoming one of the key topics, but it's like very much need, much more push. So of course, hopefully there will be like much more work on this matter. Well, on this sense, our next speaker, Laura Ramajo, who's an adjunct researcher at the CR2, the Center for Climate Resilient Research in Chile. She is going to speak a little bit about one initiative that is also being made in another region, because we talk a lot about Africa. Now we talk about Latin America and some pioneer initiative that we are starting there, which is the LACI initiative. So Laura, up to you.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, I want to tell you about the LACI initiative and one specific initiative inside of this initiative. This is the LACI Data Tax Groups. Well, LACI is a collaborative effort between the US Global Change Research Program and the US Group of the Earth Observation and regional partners of including the Inter-American Institute for Global Change. The LACI vision is to provide opportunity for partnerships between the Caribbean, the Latin American and the North American countries to enhance capacity to perform climate risk assessment and vulnerability assessment to support local and regional decision making in response to climate change. LACI started in 2022, where bringing together representatives for 14 countries that presented different concept notes and including also 4 cluster action. In 2023, a pilot co-development space was developed and where teams advance working around these 4 clusters. We are going to talk more later about this, which are these 4 clusters. And some concept notes were developed and also also this concept note was presented in different instances like Congress, forums, and many other instances. Today, we are in a moment where we are developing some prototypes. And efforts has been focused to design these prototypes, refining the concept, and also start to engage with different stakeholders, and also to find how to find funding for this initiative. This is the fourth LACI action cluster. The first one is to work in El Salvador and is related to strengthening the capacity in El Salvador to assess the impact of climate change and human habitat, the biodiversity, forest and water resource. The second one, when with Marco we are working with colleagues from Latin America, is related with advancing data access and usability for climate risk assessment in Latin American region. And this cluster is led by this data team that I was talking before. And this specific cluster is trying to develop a climate impact observatory for all Latin America. The third one is very similar to the first, but working in the Amazony, and the four cluster action is related to improve the national disaster preparedness and emergency area operation policy, intervention and engagement with Jamaica policy maker. Specifically, the action cluster 2, is focusing and establishes a climate observatory, impact observatory, working with Swiss countries in the Latin America, Uruguay, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, the United States, and Argentina. And the primary goal of this observatory is to co-develop an integrated, multi-scalable, interoperable, traceable, and secure data and information observatory to track and assess climate impact risks. While the observatory is main thematic focus of this observatory is related to water security, including the scarcity, the stress, or the excess, or the quality of the water, there are also another encompass also another impact that are related with the health, with the food security, energy supply, and ecosystem service. And also, the observatory aims to improving the data access, usability, and interoperability. This is a very important problem that we have in Latin America because we don't have too much data, but also it's too difficult to find and to compare data because they are generated at different ways and using different protocols. Also is to enhance the cross-stakeholder communication to advance in the assessment of climate climate-related risks, and also vulnerability, and also finally to assess cascading climate risks related with disaster, and also related with the impacts of water resource, human habitats, and biodiversity. And specifically, we are now in a process to develop a pilot study. This is La Plata Basin. This pilot project is now underway and is focusing in one of the most vulnerable basin in the Latin America. This is because this basin has important characteristics that make more vulnerable and in risk to climate change. For example, more than 128 million people are living in this space, so depends of this basin. Is including also five countries, more than 3 million square kilometers of surface. Also sustain a high biodiversity and a lot of ecosystems that are important in the mitigation and adaptation to climate change, and also is sustaining now important socio-economical sector like fishing, tourism, like human settlement, transport, and many others. So also, we have been observed in the last year and during this year that this basin is also highly impacted by climate change. Like this year, the floodings in Brazil that have important impacts on people with more than 700,000 people be living now in shelter, or more than 100 people dead or missing, and other injuries. We are working now in this, but we have been now some advancement and achievement. For example, we have been developing some efforts to present and to promote this pilot with different stakeholders in different strategic meetings with potential also collaborators. Also, we have now an expert group with researchers from different countries, from United States, Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. We are working that, and now we are working. We are going to develop a workshop in December in Santiago de Chile. Okay, I'm going to show you this. This is the workshop. This is in December between 16 and 18. You are invited to participate. There are two options to participate: in remote and also in person. If you want to participate, you can write us, or also we can ask to Marco and me if you want to. And the idea is to join with the different stakeholders that are interested to develop this climate observatory for the La Plata Basin, and create also determine which are the regional priorities in terms of water security and other sectors, but also construct what is going to be the governance of this system. So if you are Santiago with the mountains, it's very nice, and that December is when it's going to be hot. Also, okay, and the last one is for COP30. We are trying to generate a prototype of this observatory that we hope to present during the next COP. This is, thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for presenting us this exciting initiative, which is very much at its beginning. So we will see how it evolves. It's like also boundarying between the science, the policy, different countries. So there is a lot to be done there, but it's also a very nice opportunity to be building something like in Chile. There was a strong experience in building these kind of data platforms as form of boundarying between science policy that have been quite effective, but in other parts of Latin America there was kind of a demand and request for that, and that's also what caused and demanded like these kind of experiences. Now, to go on and also careful of time, what we'll do is that we will go directly to the second panel, and then which is basically a short presentation of the Race to Resilience of one of those and the experience of one of their partners, and then we will get to a space for the Q&A for all the speakers. So I will do this. Okay. So I will do a very short presentation of the Race to Resilience for who doesn't know that. No, just stay there because we'll just make a Q&A. Yes. So just this is very short because I think most of you already heard of this, but I don't know because like it's a very this complicated policy and practical space around here. So the Race to Resilience is one of the campaigns of the Climate Champions team, the high-level Climate Champions. As you probably know, the high-level Climate Champions are the two rotating figures that work with the COP presidencies to accelerate, align, articulate, and push in general climate action by non-state actors and other non-party stakeholders. And there are like different campaigns. These are initiatives and agendas that the Climate Champions build in different moments. And one of the leading ones in terms of adaptation is the Race for Resilience campaign, which has the ambition of accelerating robust, transparent, and effective efforts by non-party stakeholders to make 4 billion people more resilient to climate change. 4 billion because that's the number that we know that would be impacted by climate change, even if we are relatively effective in mitigation. So this, in general, the vision, the work of the Climate Champions team is to advance towards an equitable, net zero, resilient, and nature positive world by 2050. This means that this requires, on the one hand, a stronger national policy. So we know that there is all the effort that is being doing by negotiation, by NENAP, by the NDCs, by all the work that is being doing here at the COP. But at the same time, reaching that goal also requires stronger action by non-party stakeholders. We know, for instance, that best case scenario thing is not working anymore, so it would just be like this. Even in the best case scenario, finance by parties and by states won't be enough to close the adaptation gap. We know that many of the efforts need to be local, and that requires the work of subnational actors such as cities and regions. Much work is already being done by international think tanks, NGOs, boundary organization, and all that we have been hearing so far. So, and the point is that instead of disperse all this action, how we can articulate, push it forward, enable it, and this is the work that is being trying to do here. So up to this moment, in 2024, in the progress report that was launched yesterday at the Resilient Hub, we have 41 partner initiatives that are all global coalitions, including more than 700 members, a collective pledge by all these members for 3.26 billion people. This is a pledge. This is not action that are already being developed, but are in the course of being developed. And this is like approaching the target that was 4 billion at the beginning. For $40 billion to be mobilized in adaptation finance for implementation, 164 countries targeted by the collective effort, 81 regions associated Adapt initiative, which is one of our partners that we have. And now we're working in this moment to go from pledges and plans to implementation. So this year is the year in which we have been starting to track a little bit the implementation, and this will be receiving a very high push during next year, because one of the things the campaign does is articulate, but the other thing that it does is tracking and monitoring, evaluating the work that is done, because as Emily was also saying at the beginning, to advance on that, we need action, but we also need monitoring and evaluation to make sure that the action is really occurring and doesn't must occur both in state actors and non-state actors. And for that, we need, among other things, metrics that can show the effectiveness of what we're doing. And this requires science in many ways. So this is why we, as a research center, are working and partnering with the climate champions to help build and operate the technical framework of this. So this is just a snapshot of the kind of different partners that we have around. They're all very different, and they work in very different ways. We're also trying to articulate a community of learning and practice around these to not only accelerate the work, but also learn how to do it better. And we have several examples of what is happening here. That's what we call the solution stories, which are like key example on the grounds of actions that are being taken, that are working, that have a real measurable impact. And we also have transparent metrics for all the wall impact. That's what I showed to you before, but it's all in full detail for each of the partners of the campaign. And that all can be accessed to the an interactive dashboard that we are having that we call Data Explorer, that will also be linked to the transparency and accountability. So we make sure that this is making a robust and transparent and ever more ambitious impact and adaptation. In general, looking ahead, we are always working to recruit more members. So again, if you are a member that you feel like about the organization, you can be part of the INBOA. If or that wants to make an impact at scale and a field that can be also working in monitoring evaluation of their impact, please do contact us so you can join, because we will be trying to grow ever more and trying to get more organization connected to the network so that we can advance on that. Also, all that we do is connected very strictly all global effort. We will also be improving, trying to make it more partners like this. Is it working better? Yeah, okay. Thank you. I cannot listen to myself, it wasn't working. And then we will be strengthening all the engagement so we can make them work more with the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda Task Forces, create more learning, create more synergies between the actors. These have been very effective up to the moment. And of course, we also always work in showcasing the evidence that we get at the several reports that we do through the Data Explorer and through the different initiatives through the year. And so, yeah, if you want to be part of the campaign, you have the opportunity to do that, to be joining, to be part of a global campaign, to showcase your work and contribute to the climate agenda in adaptation. And so this is always an open opportunity, and you can just know more and do that by using also the QR code. But now, more than just speaking about the campaign itself, I'd like for you to know a little bit the experiences of who works into that. And so we have here one specific partner of the campaign, which is the Adaptation Research Alliance. So Jesse, I would like to call you to stage now to talk to us a little bit about your work. The Adaptation Research Alliance is a partner of the campaign from its very beginning. It's also been working very much in collaboration with us, not only in showcasing their work and their impact, but also in helping us to develop the metrics framework that we use to track the progress. And also the is a boundary organization in many ways, but it's also a network, let's say, of other boundary organizations. So there is here a very strong synergy and collaboration. So thank you very much, Jesse, for being here, and up to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Marco. I've been digesting everything we've heard here, and I'm wondering, what are we? it's I think quite a challenge. No, but what we really are is we are a global coalition that's actually made up of diverse members. So in that way, I think that what we do is, you could say, we either break boundaries, or maybe what I'd like to say is we probably try to merge boundaries. And we try to merge boundaries between the spheres of policy, practice, and action. So currently we have over 260 members, and actually that includes CR2, includes AWB, but it's not actually the alliance itself that does the work, right? The alliance is a space to bring together initiatives and organizations to actually collectively drive a paradigm shift in the way that we do action-oriented research on adaptation. So with this, I guess we're very well aligned with IMBOA, because we see boundary organizations as being a critical part of the approach which we kind of take, which is called Adaptation Research for Impact. So within that Research for Impact approach, boundary organizations really play a critical role here. And I think with regard to Adaptation Without Borders, like I said, we're not trying to necessarily break boundaries. We're trying to really kind of merge boundaries. And of course, to work across boundaries, you need many different actors to come together to actually make that happen. And this is what the Alliance tries to do, is bring together these like-minded organizations. Though I will say, Kathy, from your presentation, I was really hoping to hear the story about coffee in terms of Germany and Brazil. So if you haven't heard that before, do ask after. I've told it many places because it's a great example, I think, of transboundary risks or cascading risks here. But I think importantly, and this goes to, as Marco was saying, the Adaptation Research Alliance has been a member of the Race to Resilience from the start. So we're very much a part of the idea of trying to increase resilience of 4 billion people by 2030. But what we are focused on is, like I said, that nexus between research in adaptation and implementation of adaptation solutions here. So Marco also mentioned the metrics that they're developing, and something that we have had a challenge with and have been working with R2R, and I think we've come with a great framework that has been developed by CR2, is about how can we measure our impact as a network. And I guess maybe to try to draw some linkages to some of our other panelists here, how can a boundary organization measure their impact? They're not producing publications. They're not implementing things on the ground. So how can they have impact? And this is something I think that, with Race Resilience, that we've been kind of working on a way to actually help measure that. So just to, if you need some ideas, do speak with Marco. he's right over there. And I think one thing that's important about the area, and the reason that we did come together and it was launched at COP26, is that what we recognized is there is an urgent need to respond to the knowledge gaps and the knowledge needs that help us develop adaptation solutions. Because we do know a lot and we must act now. We do not have time to do a conventional research project, wait 2 years, wait 4 years, and then give the findings through a boundary organization to someone to implement them. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're responding at the urgency and at the scale of the climate crisis through action-oriented research here. And I think importantly there, just a bit of a reflection here is that, as I said, we do know a lot, but there's also many unknowns. And two things really stand out with things I've heard from others. But one is, we do know that the climate we live in today, in this decade, is going to be different from the climate that we live in the next 10 years. And we do know that following 10 years is also, again, going to be different from what we're experiencing now and what we experience in the following decade. So we know we need to start adapting now, but we don't have exactly everything that we need to know. So we must be doing this in a very flexible and adaptive manner in the way that we're actually doing our research and the way that we're developing and implementing solutions here. And then I think a very important reflection here in the spirit of COP, and also, of course, in the spirit of the late and the great Dr. Salim El-Hook, is at one session similar to this one panel one day, he reminded us, he said, I want you all here in the audience and you online to just remember that everything that is being done today is not for you. Because your future, your climate trajectory is locked in right now. Nothing is changing in our lifetime, or rather, the changes that we make today will not affect anything in our lifetime. So we're doing this for future generations. And I think that's an important reminder here. In terms of the ARA's work itself, I think there's a couple of areas I'd like to highlight, because it's not so much working at a transboundary scale, because as I said, the ARA itself doesn't actually do the work. It's our members who are doing this work. There are members who are driving this transboundary work. what the ARA does do and what the Secretariat does do is it creates some spaces for collaboration. So one of the examples that we have is tracking, learning, and sharing. And in our tracking, learning, and sharing, it's a space that really fosters collaboration around specific issues. So we have had learning journeys around how to better link research and action. So bringing together people who are working in the research space, people who are working in the action space, and bring them together to actually have peer-to-peer facilitated learning journeys. We've done the same in terms of adaptation metrics. So actually, maybe we can bring this, the latest, race to resilience, the race to resilience metrics into these conversations. Our own metrics to that conversation. From other experiences. Also indigenous and local knowledge, the importance of that and developing adaptation solutions. So again, these are spaces that we create to allow members to come together to share. And like I said, I think we're merging boundaries because it's not conversations amongst researchers, it's amongst practitioners and researchers and funders as well, which I think is another important piece. And another part here, because I do want to leave some time for our conversation, is co-creation processes. And in these co-creation processes, or we call co-creation spaces, we also are ultimately aiming for kind of a program design, a co-created program that emerges from a collaborative process. And again, we're trying to bring together different types of actors, so merge these boundaries amongst our members. And with this, one of the experiences we have has been the SECURE framework, which is the strengthening, enhancing contextual urban resilience. So, if we are going to reach those 4 billion by 2030, I would venture a guess that urban centers are a really good place to start resilience initiatives. And that's just purely by numbers, not because of importance. Obviously, we need the rural, we need the coastal areas, but urban places are obviously core when you're looking at numbers and people. But what we've done in this urban resilience process is this urban resilience co-creation process is brought together over 120 organizations from Latin America and the Caribbean, from Sub-Saharan Africa, from South Asia, to really help share experiences on when they're implementing and delivering urban resilience initiatives, creating urban labs, what have been their challenges, what has been their successes, and creating a way to strengthen the possibility, or for us to create a framework to allow actors in this urban resilience space to improve the way that urban resilience initiatives are designed and how they're delivered here. So what we basically found out through these consultations is that many of these initiatives really didn't understand the political, the institutional, or the cultural context of the cities. And when I say cultural, I mean kind of informal, versus formal settlements. And so sometimes these initiatives, with all good intentions, go on, but they don't understand how the city thinks, so to speak. So this framework helps people to understand how they can best how the city thinks and how they can best improve and design urban resilience interventions here. So again, the reason I'm saying this in the transboundary context is because I think, again, it's not actually working across boundaries or political or legal boundaries, but we're actually working across actors in the way that they come together to develop these. And then with the race resilience, like I said, what we want to be doing is really aiming for those numbers and aiming for those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And yeah, I think maybe actually to answer Emily's question here, what can be done and should be done to link with state actors? That's a good question, because the ARA, we don't have any state actors, but we do have departments of government. So we don't have any governments in there, but we have various departments. We have the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. We have Canada's International Development Research Centre. So we have different government departments. But I think the response, to be quite honest, is I don't know. Because I think one of the challenges that we see here is that politics and policy in terms of programs really doesn't necessarily reflect the evidence. And I think quite often it doesn't even reflect the personal views of the civil servants and the people delivering those. I think these are really kind of systemic issues that we need to figure out, how can we crack the nut of changing the way that states are actually representing their people and themselves. And I think, unfortunately, that's been quite evident last week with some of these negotiations that we've been hearing about here. But I invite everybody to help answer that question, because it's a question we need answered.
Thank you very much, Jesse. So again, bridging boundaries, transcending boundaries, contesting boundaries, merging boundaries, and so many of those boundaries that we need to reflect on. So I think this conversation is very, very interesting that we're having. I would like to see whether somebody has any questions here that we can discuss. One point important, I think, in the case of Jesse, which is also important to say, is that Emily's question is provocative, but it's also something that, of course, we cannot solve here, but that should always be a little bit like with us when we move in the non-state actors world. But having worked both with non-state actors and with state actors, it does feel sometimes to me that the question becomes even more complicated because sometimes politics and policy in the same state don't even speak with one to the other. So yeah, like when we're trying to speak to them through science and through NGO and through practice, it really becomes complicated. And so it is also why these kind of networks, both Race to Resilience, the IMBOA, all that you guys do, all that has been shown here, I think this is very important to also learn how to do that in an effective way in different contexts. So yeah, we have like 10 minutes. So I would like to open it up now for any questions or reflections. If anybody wants to venture an answer to the question and just point out to another question, here we have time for that. To you, Mike.
Thank you, and thank you for the great presentations. Perhaps I'd be curious to just hear your thoughts on what you think is the biggest challenge to accomplish successful boundary work to accelerate adaptation, and perhaps are there certain key ingredients to successful boundary work that can be replicated to other contexts to accelerate adaptation?
Somebody wants to venture with an answer here?
Great question. It's hard to pick one. I would say those working at the interface between science and policy are often inhabiting the think tank space, right? We work in think tanks. And we are, well, I can only speak from SCI's perspective, but we are still largely very much a bit like the adaptation field more broadly, project-driven. We have to spend our time largely, ordinarily, on about 4 or 5 maybe different projects, and it can be hard to get this kind of work funded. Now, I think that's beginning to change. I think there's a recognition that this sort of work, this interface, this role we play in bridging domains is really important. But to be successful in informing and influencing policy, it requires time, it requires investment, it requires long-term engagement, relationship building, being able to identify the policy processes that your science, your research is best placed to inform, and then often engaging for them over the long term. I mean, we aimed within Adaptation Without Borders to get some decision text at the COP, 5 years ago, and it took 5 years of concerted effort to do that. And really, this is only just the beginning. Getting some words on a paper is great, but you then need to leverage that and then explore how to implement those actions and decisions. So often, I think the project-based nature of think tank work inhibits really the resourcing that is required for this kind of work to build staff capacities and to then allow networking and exchange and the sharing of skills and expertise and intel and information between organizations around the world.
I totally join you on the project-driven work and the financing issue. Again, based on my own expertise for 4C in Morocco. So we're actually not a think tank, and I think that brings its own challenges sometimes. And I'm particularly thinking of ownership. How do you convince the stakeholders in the research space to trust you and to work with you? And then how do you do the same thing with the policymakers, the usually people working on the public sectors, or local authorities, or the private sector? So that's one. I think you need some early wins, and it's not because you will come across resistance. You need to make your, I don't like this expression, but you like this business model. Like, what's your added value as a center. Like, what are you bringing to me as a university? Why would I work with you? Why don't I go straight to the public sector? So you need to learn to make your case to both words. So that's one. And I think the second thing, especially on the science policy interface, you come in with this climate adaptation urgency, or the goal is to accelerate climate adaptation, to create these links. But you're working, and this is probably a developing country perspective, but you're working with a sector that's already struggling with other challenges that have nothing to do with climate adaptation. A lack of financing, probably fragmented stakeholders. So how do you make sure that you come in trying to solve the issue of climate adaptation, and not get overwhelmed with other challenges that really are outside of your mandate, one, that you don't necessarily have the means to overcome, unfortunately, but you still need to take into account to make the thing you're supposed to be doing advance and progress. So I think I would, again, the list is long, but I think I would focus really on ownership, and how to make things progress despite other challenges that are not necessarily related to vulnerability and climate adaptation. I hope that answers your question, Mai.
I can come in here. I had two thoughts on this. First, I would say one is that we must go beyond it, and this isn't, I'm not saying that you have, this is in your question, but I think many people do think this, is we must move beyond the model of producing research, giving it to a boundary organization, and then having that be used, because we know that that model doesn't work. We have to be bringing in people who are instead of end users, we could say knowledge users. We have to bring in the knowledge users at the very start of that process. And that's not to say a boundary organization doesn't have a role, and of course have a critical role, but it's got to be a different process than just a research production and then dissemination. That's first. And then I think it's very critical just to, in that process, is to ask the question of the research itself has to be needs-based, right? And then the challenge there comes to whose needs. And this kind of goes to the point that I said before, is that a community's needs is not necessarily the state actors' needs, or non-state actors' needs are not always the same. And that's just, I think, the reality. So it's also how can we merge those? How can we bring those voices and those needs up to make it such an issue that the state actors, to use the terminology here, actually have to respond. And like Katie was saying, that takes time.
Maybe add one thing. On the research needs, because I'm finding what you said really, really interesting. But what I've realized also in my work is that sometimes the research community is able to tell the state, wait a second, actually the needs of the vulnerable of the communities are these and not that. So it's also interesting to create those links, because the research needs to be based on needs, but the research can also establish the right needs and tell the policymakers. I was just thinking, just wanted to share. Thank you.
Those are very good points, and lots of food for thought and reflection here. We have like 2 minutes left if anybody has one other question. Otherwise, I do. But just very, very short, in who of you wants to do, and that it's not. So it does seem to me when I hear you that there is a lot, all of these, both the transboundary work and the cross-boundary or bridging boundary of a boundary organization is a lot of work of changing the way in which science work, in which policy work, in which the connection works, in which we think about adaptation and risk. And one of the things that stood up a little bit during the adaptation discussion last week particularly was all the idea of transformational adaptation. What does it mean? What does it not mean? And all the confusion on that. So any reflection on that? Does this all experience we have teaches us any lesson on why and how should transformation be tackled in adaptation? Anyone else want to try?
Just a couple of sentences. I would say this, but I think adaptation to transboundary climate risk is more transformational adaptation. If we're trying to manage transboundary climate risks, we're trying to do adaptation that crosses boundaries, crosses sectors, is of a scale and order of magnitude that we haven't seen before, that it is truly systemic. And I would advocate that that is one way in which we can make adaptation more transformational, is to really look at a system level that crosses these sorts of boundaries that we've been talking about so far.
I can always say something. Why not? I'm up here. No, I agree with what you said. And I guess I would just add to that. I think it's very critical to bring in a strong learning component about what you've said, because as I said, we know a lot and we must act, but we don't know everything. So while we're doing our adaptation solutions now, we have to be learning from what we're delivering to make sure that we know whether we're on the right track or not. And we have to be then adaptive in the implementation solutions. The other thing I would say, and I know this goes against the whole research ethos, is don't get caught up in the terminology, right? Is that we need to be acting. So whether it's, I think the point of what is transformational adaptation and what isn't is to make sure that by saying transformational adaptation is that we're actually making significant step changes in the way that we're seeing and responding to the climate impacts and crisis, not that we're doing one little thing at a time. And I think that's the main message of transformational adaptation.
So thank you. With that, we now close the session to leave a space panel. But I want to thank you very much, first of all the speakers, so big applause for them just in the end, and for everybody that accompanying us. If you want to know more about INBO, Race to Resilience, you can also find the QR code here. And with that, I welcome you to enjoy all the rest of the week here. Thank you very much. Bye.